my presentation topic is, as Erica has said, interpreting and anger management counselling sessions with male perpetrators of family violence. So in my presentation today, I'll be going back a few steps. I'm a practicing interpreter, and later on in this presentation I'll be drawing on recollections that I've had working with counsellors and with male clients who have been part of diversion programs for anger management counselling. But I want to go back a few steps to actually look at what is anger, because that's one of the words which is included in the topic of the presentation. What is violence? And what is anger management counselling? I'm then going to talk about how people find themselves in the position where they're engaging in anger management counselling. In many cases, this can be voluntary. In other cases, in most cases, though, it's involuntary. And it's involuntary as a result of court diversion programs. Are we then talking briefly about the clients that I've worked with? And in terms of preparing for these types of assignments, I'll be talking about content matter and also the therapeutic tools that counsellors use in these situations. And then giving you some examples of the language that perpetrators use and also that used by counsellors. So look, as all conscientious interpreters, when you know that you're working with a counsellor and a perpetrator in an anger management session, you go to the internet, of course, to find out, okay, if I haven't done this before, what is this going to be like? What type of things are going to be asked by the counsellor? What kinds of things can I expect from the perpetrator or the client to be talking about? And so I've cherry-picked some things from the internet. What is anger as an emotion? Which is something that all of us have felt in this room hundreds, thousands of times. And at what point does anger become something which affects a person's behaviour so that they engage in acts of violence? And these are things which you might agree with or not agree with, but they appeal to what we think, or what, at least the people who compose these things, what anger is amongst human beings. So it can be something which is expressed, which is similar to other negative feelings such as anxiety, such as distress, such as jealousy. But there is often a target of this anger. The last line says here, when people feel angry, they can become single-minded and focus on an apparent provocateur, the person responsible for that anger. Of course, when we witness situations of injustice, anger is a perfectly normal, justifiable emotion to feel. Now, anger management sessions for male perpetrators of domestic violence. This kind of suggests that anger automatically leads to violence, and that's not the case. All of us in this room have felt anger, and I hope none of us have become violent at any part in our biographies. So there's not this one-to-one relationship where one equals the other. At the same time, violence can occur in the absence of anger. Usually when this happens, this is particularly disturbing because these are often described as cold-blooded crimes, where a person very coolly, dispassionately is doing something, inflicting harm on another person without any obvious sense of rage or anger. So I am going to be focusing here when anger does result in violence. That's perhaps an important distinction to make. Maribel, Professor del Porto de Trivigno, gave us a list this morning about what types of violence this could be. And the more prominent, conspicuous forms of violence are physical and sexual violence. But as she also reminded us, there's also psychological violence, which is harder to often demonstrate or report afterwards. There's also emotional abuse and also financial abuse. And these are some examples, some definitions taken. And this is just a small selections of the types of behaviours that this is referring to. Okay, you're an interpreter and you're preparing for this anger management interaction. There are lots of anger management courses out there. And this is an excerpt from the internet where an anger management business or counselling services describes what is anger management. And there are words here which talk about managing control or controlling one's emotions. And the second paragraph contained here, one way to reduce anger is to look at it into its cause. You should be thinking, is it worthwhile to make myself angry and sick just because another person is ill-natured enough to provoke me? Does it mean that I can allow myself to be aggravated by others? This kind of suggests that managing anger is simply an exercise in control, self-control. Thank you very much, Erica. And it also, the last line appeals to, are you so weak that you can be hurt by anyone that makes you angry? So here it's appealing to, if you're feeling anger, it's perhaps some sort of weakness of your personality or character for this to be occurring. You might think, do you agree with these things? But this is actually what's being sold as in a business sense as what anger management is. So when you do come across these things and you're preparing for assignments, you could be coming across things with this kind of content. There are perhaps some commonly known strategies that you've heard of for people who, when they feel angry often, what they should do with that anger. Often they want to do something physical or immediate. They want to direct or channel their anger into something. And so lots of kind of folksy remedies for this might be things such as hitting a pillow, which is better than hitting a person, counting up to 10, taking deep breaths, and so on. Now, in some cases, these types of tips might be able to deal with anger at a certain level, but if anger is of a deeper level, if anger is of a greater quantity, then perhaps it can't be controlled in such a way. And so there's a suggestion here that these types of exercises will treat the symptoms of anger, but they won't treat the causes. As is suggested here, they may calm you down for a short while, but the source of your anger may still appear again. If it keeps occurring and reoccurring and it's controlling your behavior, this is a situation in which you might need professional help. So, anger management counselling sessions that I've worked in with male perpetrators of family violence have been, in all of my cases, a result of diversionary programs that are ordered by the magistrates or family court. For those less familiar with community corrections orders, orders which can be given at magistrates' courts where a restraining order is taken out, where the magistrate, where there's sufficient evidence for the magistrate to be convinced that violence has been committed, etc., can issue a diversionary order to a perpetrator. Of those people who have been issued with an order are involuntary attendees at these counselling sessions. These counselling sessions themselves can be individual, with a counsellor. They can also be with other family members. So the people that you could be working with are counsellors, psychologists. I've never worked with psychiatrists in these situations. Psychotherapists can also take on work like this, but most of the people that you'll be working with, at least in this sector, in this state, are counsellors, who themselves are usually clinical psychologists, or at least qualified psychologists. Now, I've worked with psychologists in lots of other areas, not just within anger management, etc. And in working out what type of approach a psychologist is going to take in these types of interactions, some sort of information, some sort of knowledge of how counsellors work and what types of approaches they could be adopted are very useful for us as interpreters, because we can anticipate, we can foresee what types of approaches they'll be adopting and what's going to actually come out of their mouths. One of the most widely used approach used by psychologists is that of the cognitive behavioural therapy. And what cognitive behavioural therapy seeks to do is to work with a client and to work out what thoughts are influencing their behaviour. Because the principle behind this approach is that if certain forms of behaviour are happening, the counsellor tries to locate what things were going through the mind, what types of thoughts were being held by the perpetrator when this was happening. Because the key is, if that kind of thought process can be changed or adopted or addressed, that can then also change the behaviour, to remove the chance that violent behaviour could persist. And cognitive behavioural therapy is a commonly used tool in a number of areas. It can treat things such as phobias, anxiety, depression, etc. Judy, correct me if I'm wrong as well, if I get some of these details. Well, there'll be a panel as well for you for us to be able to discuss these things. Now, a counsellor who is adopting an approach of cognitive behavioural therapy is trying to work out what's happening. They're trying to match actions, but also try and locating what thoughts the person could have been having at the time when those actions were committed. And so what you can expect, and these are things that I recall coming from counsellors, are these types of questions that they put to the perpetrators. That's one approach. Another approach, and I didn't know about this approach until I researched this topic in preparation for this presentation, is an approach which was developed in America about 25 years ago. And this is drawing on the work that colleagues actually from Monash University in social work, Thea Brown, have done a lot of work looking at the effectiveness of counselling sessions for male perpetrators of violence. And in America, a particular approach was trialled. It's called the Dualist Model, which is a feminist approach, i.e. it sees violence as a systemic occurrence of behaviour, and it's caused because of fundamental differences and inequalities, I should say, in society between the genders. And so one of the principles of this approach is confrontation and education. That men need to be made aware of their own violence, and that the excuses or the rationalizations or other things such as blaming others are things which are not tolerated. And that they're also made accountable for the violence that they perpetrate against others. Now, when I recall working with counsellors, I can recall some questions such as these, which would be asked by a counsellor who is working according to this approach, that's trying to tease out, does the perpetrator, does the person who committed the violence actually acknowledge that they committed this, and that they understand that what they did is unacceptable, etc. And so these types of questions are in line with that type of approach. There's also another approach that psychologists can adopt, and I've come across this one less frequently, and I've only learnt about this again, as I said, in hindsight. I knew I have a certain amount of knowledge of cognitive behavioural therapy, etc., but I didn't know about these approaches. The Jenkins model is a less confrontational approach, and it frames counselling as an opportunity for the perpetrator to take responsibility. That's the key characteristic about this approach. And it also acknowledges that men's violence can be an expression for the desire for control. And this approach also acknowledges the exacerbating influence of alcohol and drugs. Not that this approach suggests that these are alcohol and drugs are defences for why this happens, but these can exacerbate a situation which is already getting out of control. And so psychologists who are working according to the Jenkins model are keen at looking at if the person, the perpetrator, is interested in actually taking responsibility and to make changes in life. Okay, these are the only six interactions that I have worked in as an interpreter for anger management counselling. On the left-hand side, you have the actual participants. In most cases, I was working with the counsellor and the perpetrator alone, the three of us. In two instances, we were working also with the perpetrator's wife, and in one instance with the perpetrator's daughter. The decision about who was included in the sessions was made by the counsellor, not me. In all of the cases, their attendance, the perpetrator's attendance at these sessions was involuntary. They were there as a result of diversionary orders. And the format of the session is in the middle column here. The format gives you details about whether this was the initial session at the first point at which they were meeting with the counsellor, and the types of things that occurred in that interaction. And this will come as no surprise to many of you who've worked in similar situations, that in initial interactions, the counsellor is looking to see what are the risk factors. And the risk factors are associated with risks to oneself and to others, as well as to themselves as well. And so there are often a battery of questions which can be typically asked at an initial assessment that seek to elicit information: how present or how likely is this violent behaviour occurring? And I'll give some examples later, which are checklists, if you like, that elicit information about what could be happening in terms of violence towards others. In the last column on the right-hand side, I've put the counselling approach. Now, I say this with a question. I put a question mark here because I don't have absolute conviction that the type of approach that the counsellor was working with are these ones. This is not a question that I brought up during the briefing or the debriefing, but something which I assumed on the basis of how they were working. And so you can see that on the basis of the types of questioning and types of therapy that the counsellor was using with the perpetrators, that there's a variety of different approaches that are being used here in this, or at least in this state, in Victoria. You'll see here, say for example, the second bottom one. This is a routine checkup session where a client who had been attending these sessions for some time had a gap of 2 months. And in the period leading up to this routine checkup session, the counsellor wanted to check on a number of forms of behaviour, whether these were being exercised or shown by the perpetrator or not. Okay, so in initial sessions, the types of questions that can be asked, and these will be familiar to many of you who've worked in mental health interactions, where you are working with a counsellor or a psychologist to work out what's happening with the person that they're working with. There can be, there's a whole range of things that this type of list can elicit. And there's lots of other tools, such as the mental health inventory scale, the mini mental questionnaire, etc. But this is a range of things which can be elicited in the first place as an initial, at an initial meeting. And I might give you the chance to have a look at them before I move on to the next slide. In a routine visit, a checkup, these were things which were asked by a counsellor. And so you see here a range of questions which are eliciting whether psychological violence is still occurring, whether physical violence is still occurring, and also sexual in the case of the fifth last one. So these can be regular checkup points or routine questions which are asked by counsellors to work out if types of physical or other types of violence are still being perpetrated. And you might think, well, why wouldn't you just ask a question such as, what things have you been doing? One of the things about perpetrators is that they're often very reticent, very reluctant to talk about what they've actually done to other people. And so checklists are often a way for counsellors to be able to elicit types of behaviour that do cover this. The types of questions that counsellors can also ask relate not only to, let's say, the partner or significant other of the perpetrator, but also to others who live in the household. And so this relates also to children. A number of speakers have talked also about the presence of children or other family members, etc., who can be witnesses and also victims themselves of violence. And so this is a checklist to draw your attention to the fact that it might be certain types of behaviour might be inflicted on one member of the family and others on another member of the family. And you can see here that this list relates to physical violence only. This is also a reflective checklist, which was provided for a client, in which over the last 4 weeks a further range of questions were asked, which again attempted to elicit information on whether there had been physical, sexual, or also financial abuse that the perpetrator had perpetrated against victims. I'm now going to come to the perpetrators and how they worked in the sessions, how they responded to the counsellor, what types of positions they took when engaging with the counsellor. And when I reflect on how the clients worked with the counsellors, the 6 of them, I would describe the way that they worked with the counsellors in 3 ways. And this is according to how they grouped with the clients, amongst the clients that I was working with. Amongst 3 of the clients, I would describe the way that they worked with the counsellor as a position of reluctant acceptance. So they acknowledged that they had been violent, but they didn't talk about it easily. They didn't volunteer information about this easily. It was a process of the counsellor having to really work hard to elicit, to often go sideways, to work out ways to try and get a person to open up before this would happen. And so you can see some quite reticent, some quite reluctant responses from 2 of them. And again, these are my recollections. These weren't taped. In the last sentence of the first excerpt here, I can't give you guarantees. So I want to try and do this, etc., but I'm not hopeful that this is going to be successful for me. I don't want to give any promises. The second participant talked about it needs to come out, this anger and this violence. I don't really want to do this to her, but this thing's happened. And maybe medicine will help me. Amongst all of the perpetrators, the clients that I was working with, there was often a feeling that this, because they were involuntary participants in this, that the process of therapy was simply chatting, was simply talking. There was a great reluctance to actually see this as a means of treatment. For them, treatment was a tangible pill, was a tangible something, either a physical, something that you actually took. This changed over time with most of them, but initially they saw medicine, pills, pharmaceuticals as being an answer to address this. Amongst 2 of the perpetrators, there was complete non-acceptance of what the counsellor was trying to do with them. And this is literally what one of them says, these are all lies. There was overwhelming evidence of what had happened, about the violence, about what the perpetrator had committed, etc. This particular perpetrator refused to accept any of this and refuted it and said it's all untrue, these are all lies, she's making this up, this is invented. Or someone has told her to say these things, I didn't do anything to her, she's fine, and she likes to tell stories. So there's a number of things happening here. There's not only refusal to accept one's behaviour, there's also there's channeling the blame for this onto her, or that she is the actual guilty party. I'm completely innocent, this is something that she's made up. She's the problem, not me. And the next one is a very disturbing reaction, where violence was described as an example of how much he loved her. And he said this, because I love her so much, I get jealous easily. And so that's why I feel this way. When I think she's doing things with others, it's because I love her too much. This is for me, this is something which I wasn't expecting, but this was the narrative that this perpetrator had told himself about why this happens and how he can excuse it. The last one was openly antagonistic towards his wife and talked about her morals, talked about her reputation, and that this was justified retribution for actions that she had allegedly committed. One of the things about working as an interpreter is we're closely aligned with how people are speaking or signing. We have to be, because we're working with their language and replicating it. Not only their language, but also their emotions and what their intent is and when they convey things to others. One of the difficult things, and we've talked a lot about stress and burnout, etc. One of the hard things as an interpreter, as you can imagine, is when there is complete discord between the two parties here, where the perpetrator or the client is refusing to accept what has happened, and the counsellor is trying to work with that person to find ways to address their forms of behaviour. This is really challenging. And it has consequences on our interpreting performance. I'm also, even just in terms of linguistic level, etc., when you're working, when there's such anger or there's such opposition to what a person is trying to do, it's an extra level of stress as an interpreter that you bear, which affects your area to perform. So look, in concluding what occurs in interpreted anger management courses, what I can conclude on the basis of the work that I've done, is that the courses themselves seek to address behaviour and not only the management of anger, because management of anger is one thing, it's actually the concrete stopping of violence, which is the goal, which is the purpose of the involuntary order. The sample that I'm working from is only a small one, and it's restricted to the ones that I've worked with, so in a particular linguistic community. The participants I was working with were usually just the counsellor, but sometimes also family members. Interestingly, well, perhaps not, the perpetrators were the loud-speaking clients in those activities. Where there was a wife or daughter, they were English dominant. Within these interactions, cognitive behavioural therapy seems to be the most commonly used approach. Interactions can also include diagnostic tests and checklists, which won't come as a surprise to a large number of you. We know this, or most of us know this as experienced mental health interpreters, but the notion of counselling as a process and a form of treatment, which is something which is often not shared with the people we're working with, who are there involuntarily, who don't know what this is about, and want this to be over as soon as possible in some cases. And the perspectives that can be held by the perpetrators in this case, ranging from reluctant engagement to non-acceptance to blaming the victim as the guilty party. And those are the sources that have informed me also in preparing for this presentation. Thank you for your time, and thank you also to the sign language interpreters.